VanQ and I work at Optimus Information. We are a technology solutions company. We help other businesses move to the cloud. We offer a bunch of cloud services such as cloud management, DevOps, application development. We are primarily a Microsoft partner. We are a gold certified partner with 7 gold competencies. We have 2 offices, with Vancouver being the headquarters, and the other offshore team is based out of India. If you want to learn more about Optimus, you can check out our website. It's optimusinfo.com. Now, moving on to some housekeeping guidelines. Firstly, I request all of you to please keep your mics on mute so that there are minimal interruptions during the presentation. I would urge you to put your questions. If they are like quick questions, you need quick answers, you can put them in the chat and I can just unmute you, or I can put the questions forward to Keith and he can answer them. But if it's like a question that requires some sort of back and forth, then I would suggest that we can take that towards the end of the presentation, at the end of the presentation. And yeah, like if you feel comfortable, you can turn on your video. That way it feels a little bit more interactive. And so for moving on, our next VanQ will be on February 25th. And we have speaker Arash Tahiri, who is from Central One. And I'll put in more details about what the topic is going to be in the coming days. So please keep an eye out on our social media for that. And without further ado, now I would like to hand it off to Keith.
That's great. Thanks, Shobhat. Well, good evening, everybody. Let me just share my screen here. Can you see my screen, Shobhat?
Yes, I see your screen fine.
All right. Well, good evening. So let me just introduce myself. I am Keith Deighton, Strategic Alliance Director at Kobalt Security. And this evening, we'll actually be talking about cyber resilience. So keeping the value of organization within your organization. So a little bit about me. I'm first going to tell you that I haven't done any testing or QA, and I do have a little story to tell about QA, just as a bit of an icebreaker. But my background has been in telecommunications and electronic engineering, and also in cyber security. I've worked for Digital, IBM, TELUS, Hitachi in the past, and now work for Kobalt. My passions are riding the Harley and Freemasonry. So they're the 2 passions that keep me busy at different times when I'm not working. So let me tell you a little bit of a story about my experience in quality assurance. I actually did what they call a sandwich degree in Scotland, which was this BSc in telecommunications and electronic engineering. So I had 2 periods where I was actually working in Hewlett-Packard, and it was a great opportunity because you went from department to department. You did a couple of months here, a couple of months there. And so I did marketing and sales and R&D and procurement, and I did spend some time in the QA department, actually in the materials engineering department. And this was my first foray into the information technology field, and I noticed that everything was acronyms. So I got asked to write a report on, of all things, I did an assessment on glue for heat sinks. And so I was asked to put a report together for this. And when I put my report together, I handed it in to my boss, and because I'd seen all these acronyms, I thought, well, I'm going to come up with my own acronyms. So anyway, one of the things that I actually did was in my report, my boss said, "What does this mean, Keith?" And I says, what is it? I says, "There's a glossary at the back. It'll tell you everything." And he says, "What does cowpop mean?" So in me testing these heat sinks, we had to put them through environmental tests, heating, cold, shaking, dropping them to make sure that they didn't actually pop off. And anyway, one of the assessments that I did was cowpop, which meant that the actual heat sink came off with a pair of pliers. Anyway, that was my story of QA. Let me tell you a little bit about who Kobalt Security are. We're actually an extension to your team. We're focused on small to medium business space with packaged services priced for that particular market. We actually have a 24-hour/7 managed security offering, which is unusual and you know, for the small to medium business space. So in a lot of cases they can't afford that. So you know, coming to us to do that is really quite pertinent. And we do have a host of professional privacy and security services as well. And I like to say that we're actually your virtual security and privacy squad. So moving on to the subject matter, cyber resilience. So let's just talk about the difference, first of all, between cyber security and cyber resilience. They are quite different and have two really distinct outcomes. So cybersecurity consists of technologies, processes, and measures that are designed to protect systems, networks, and data from cybercrimes. Effective cybersecurity reduces the risk of a cyber attack and protects entities, organizations, and individuals from the deliberate exploitation of systems, networks, and technologies. Cyber resilience looks at a wider scope where it encompasses a blend of cybersecurity and business reliance. So there's a robust business continuity plan to resume operations. That's if the cyber attack itself is successful. So cyber resilience actually helps businesses recognize that hackers have the advantage of innovative tools, of the element of surprise, of, you know, the target can be successful in their attempt, and the assumption is that the hacker has in fact been successful. By actually identifying that the hacker has been successful, this concept actually helps businesses to prevent, respond, and successfully recover from to the intended secure state. In order to do this, though, it's a cultural shift as organizations see security as a full-time job and embedded practices into day-to-day operations. So secure software is actually kind of a similar thing. We're going to talk about the ITIL service model and what continual service improvement actually means. And secure software is actually a secure software development problem for its complete life cycle. And this is a life cycle of technology that's actually part of all IT. So its solution is the responsibility of every member. And same for secure software. It's a software of every member of the software development team, from managers and support staff to developers, testers, yada, yada. Security, privacy, and resilience must be on everybody's mind through every phase of the SDLC, the software development lifecycle. So, in the first portion of this ITIL service model, to kind of get some context here, is strategy, and it's understanding the objectives, identifying the risks and vulnerabilities that are within the business environment for the client. And secondly, design, selecting cyber security, cyber resilience controls, procedures, and training. So here we're establishing the roles and responsibilities for the actual design elements itself. And it's similar to kind of software development, right? And then transition is transitioning the operation of these controls that have been designed into, the operational controls that have been designed into the operation phase of the ITIL service model. And it's just as important to know how an organization designs and transitions cyber resilience controls than the actual controls themselves. For example, proper and rigorous SAST and DAST testing are minimal table stakes for both design, transition, and ongoing operations. So ongoing operations is really that day one event where you're operating, detecting, and managing cyber resilience incidents and events. And continual improvement is really wrapped around the outside of this model to ensure that everything is efficient, effective, and relevant, and is continuing to improve itself. So this process there's a continual feedback process that happens through these actual phases from strategy all the way through to operation, with healthy feedback mechanisms so that each part of the organization has the ability to learn and improve. And to require this requires a combination of metrics and reporting. And this process of continual feedback from each stage to other stages is shown graphically here. So the biggest thing I want you to get from this slide is the fact that it's not just about the technology, but it's about the proper attitude, the behavior, and culture of your organization. So one question I get asked is cyber resilience the same as fault tolerance? While these two concepts are related, they are not the same. Fault tolerance is the extent to which a functional unit will continue to operate at a defined performance level, even one or more if its components are malfunctioning. Cyber resilience, however, is actually related, but different. It's actually the ability to withstand, anticipate, and recover and adapt to adverse conditions, stresses, attacks on, or compromises of cyber resources. And that cyber resource must adapt through continual improvement in the face of a changing threat environment. So controls that were previously perfect may no longer be good enough because of the new threats and new vulnerabilities being developed by people working to undermine cyber resilience. Also, from a continually changing business environment, risk analysis previously carried out may no longer be appropriate for the business needs because of new customer expectations, new business opportunities, new laws or regulations, new competitive pressures, which may require ever higher levels of confidentiality and integrity, availability, and privacy. And finally, cyber resilience must adapt through a continually changing technology environment. So controls that worked previously may no longer be effective. So an old firewall that did its job 4 or 5 years ago may not be effective now. So that obsolescence feature needs to actually be taken into account. So here is the actual ITIL CSI approach. It's actually quite different from the 7-step improvement process that we'll actually get into, because it serves a different need. The CSI approach improvement is really intended to run continually. So it's measuring, processing, analyzing, reporting, so that improvements can be identified and implemented. And it's actually used, this approach is actually used for a major improvement project. And it typically has a well-defined start and end points and a specific scope and set of deliverables. So what we do is we build a CSI register improvements to improve the aspects of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So let's have a look at the CSI register elements that actually become a project or a sub-project. So each project within the CSI register can follow this 7-step improvement process. You can see it described here. And I guess, Shobit, I can make these slides available afterwards, if anybody wants to have copies of them.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
So we'll follow the 7-step improvement process. Now, some don't need the full cycle as they're tactical. Others are more complex and require the full cycle. And the full cycle itself can actually be used to analyze the performance and capabilities of services, processes, people, suppliers, or anything else involved in the providing of IT services to customers. Many of the steps in this process are about measurement and analysis. because it's only through measurement and analysis that we can really understand what is happening. And it reminds us of that old adage, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. It's very relevant in cyber resilience and in most business models. So let's talk about maturity models. Maturity models are used to help assess and define the status of cyber resilience or posture within an organization. And it's really useful in a stage of where do we want to be. And so there's several maturity models that can be considered when planning a cyber resilience project. These can be ITIL processes. We use the CIS Top 20 quite regularly in our office with our clients when we've got customers who are wanting to actually increase their cyber security maturity. And we also can, map customers to SOC 2 compliance and things like that, and assess their maturity based on the questions and the elements that are actually in these compliance regulations. So the analysis of the assessment against the maturity model should give what's known as a gap assessment. And it can be very useful to give a high-level summary of current status or target requirements. And things like the NIST security framework and others can be used to define that current state and also the desired future state from that baseline. So let's have a look at the ITIL process maturity framework. So this describes a service management maturity framework, and it's aligned with the CMMI, which is the Carnegie Mellon Maturity Index. It's an assessment against a framework which can be established of where we are now, and it has 5 distinct areas which can be seen here. So what should our target maturity level be? The best way to understand the maturity model is understand the current maturity level and the differences between the various levels. And over here, you'll see the 5 levels that are actually described in this maturity framework. There is, in fact, a level 0. And level 0 means that there are no controls there. There is no policies. There's no procedures. Level 1 means that you might have some policies and procedures, or you might have some technical controls, all the way up to level 5, where you've got controls based in your environment, and they're based on business goals, and they're focused on continual improvement, and are also part of the general culture of the environment. So the NIST cybersecurity framework is a typical kind of framework that's used. And in the term cybersecurity or cyber resilience, we are referring to the NIST cybersecurity framework here, and the term that NIST uses. The meaning in this context is the same as the cyber resilience as described. So let's look at this 7-step process. So we're going to actually step through these 7 steps on how to focus your cybersecurity and cyber resilience in a well-defined and laid out process. So step 1 is really just understanding the strategy for improvement. So understand the context of your business, your vision, your mission, your goals, and understand how all the elements of your IT services contribute to that business. And improvement can take many forms. It can be you want to do things faster, more secure, less costly, more reliable, more available. And current and future business plans intend to deliver these. So step 2 is really identifying what should be managed. So this includes measurements of services and define what can be measured to create a gap analysis, so you know exactly where your baseline is. So there should be regular checks that the right data is actually being collected and analysed, and the effort's not being wasted collecting data that's not needed. And like all other steps of the 7-step process, this is an iterative activity. So although you baseline it, you'll always come back to that gap analysis and define what can be measured and improved over time. So it does require many different types of measurement, including audits, reviews, data from tools, processes, financial data, and much more. And there may be some overlap here with the ITSM 7-step process, but much of this data is very specific to cyber resilience. So ideally, the data requirements will be included in the design of services, processes, and technologies so that required data can be collected easily and efficiently. So now when we gather the data, we should use tools and automation so that that some of the data can be collected in that fashion, but also that some may be collected manually. Because of the need for confidentiality and integrity, there may be special considerations and how some data is gathered for cyber resilience. And we've seen examples of that in our organization where we're actually collecting logs, and some of those logs actually need to be anonymized because even the people that are working in our SOC don't need to see some of the data that's actually captured in logs because there may be personally identifiable information, for example. So step 4 is where we actually process the data. In this step, it's converted into the right format for the intended audience. So here, and when we're processing the data, we're actually looking for some KPIs or KRIs, so key performance indicators, and our key risk indicators, and generate critical success factors to ensure ultimately the information is robustly protected. So spreadsheets and reports containing data about the efficiency, effectiveness, and cost effectiveness of cyber resilience are likely to be extremely confidential, and their exposure should facilitate could facilitate a security breach. So we must make sure that the information that's collected in this stage is robustly protected, and as well as preserving the chain of evidence if needed. So step 5 is all about analysing the information, about actually looking at the data and producing trends and knowledge of what is good and bad about the things being measured. So this enables an organisation to understand whether the goals are being met and whether services and processes are getting worse. So this knowledge of trends may allow an organisation to intervene during subsequent steps to ensure that goals are met. So for example, the average time to resolve incidents has consistently reduced over a period of time. This good trend suggests that improvement to the incident management process have actually been effective. So step 6 is presenting the information. And one of the best ways to get funding for continual improvement is to report the good results of previous investments. So being able to present this in a manner that's easily digestible is really accurate, is really important. So the knowledge can now be presented in a clear and helpful format in the form of report management summary, graphs, charts to show data and trends. And audiences for the report should include customers, senior IT management, internal staff, and suppliers. Finally, we actually go to implement the improvement. So that here the knowledge has been assembled in the earlier step and combined with the previous knowledge to help decide what improvements are needed. So cyber resilience should maintain its own CSI register. The CSI register is really a list of opportunities for improvement. And it's unlikely that an organization will want to combine this with the CSI register for IT services. So it's important to actually keep a separate list of cyber security or cyber resilience elements in a different register from the IT services. And that's just because the scope is much wider than it is for just IT services. So the 7-step process then loops back to the beginning, continuing to understand the business, decide what to measure, gather the data, analyze and present information, and to implement further improvements. So many possible improvements may be identified, and should these be added to Continual Service Improvement Register, they can be prioritized. So, as most organizations already have some form of security controls in place, it is best to treat this initiative as an improvement project or even a program with outcomes. So let's go back to the CSI model. Every organization has some aspects of cyber resilience in place. And it would be rare for an organization to implement a completely new management system, for example, for cyber resilience. It's much more common to look for ways to improve the environment by asking these questions of the existing management system controls. Although the CSI approach is intended to structure a major improvement project, it typically has well-defined start and end points, a specific scope, and a set of deliverables. However, as it also has a requirement for continual improvement, it also needs to follow more of a program methodology, where outcomes of continual service improvement are delivered through organizational momentum and on a consistent basis. As an example, Kobalt Security Program as a Service will take you through this journey of continual service improvement. So let's go through these stages. So what is a vision? Before starting to plan and implement cyber resilience, it's important to understand the high-level vision, mission, goals and objectives of the project and of the organization as a whole. It's also important to engage with key stakeholders, and that will include the executive board, the senior management team, the C-suite, the business transformation, privacy stakeholders, and other different stakeholders. It's also important to gain an understanding of the business strategy and have different ideas about why they're implementing a cyber resilience project. So the outcome of this step is a clear and well-documented vision with goals and objectives for the Cyber Resilience Improvement project. The most important part of this slide is to get agreement from key stakeholders. As with most IT projects, if you do not get any buy-in from senior management, it can fail miserably. So ensuring that you actually get agreement from your key stakeholders at this stage and agreeing what the visions, the mission, goals and objectives are is critical. So where are we now? First thing we do is actually carry out what's known as a baseline assessment. So this is the first stage of an improvement project, and it provides a baseline which we can measure future improvements. So a thorough understanding is necessary of all legal, regulatory and contractual requirements and indeed privacy that may be pertinent. We're engaged a great deal at the moment in helping organizations who are being asked contractually to abide by certain guidelines or standards. An approach, and one that most of you may have heard of, is about the auditing elements of SOC 2, ISO, or NIST, or the auditing and assessment frameworks. And the evaluation for these baselines can be gauged on maturity models such as the CMMI maturity model that we explained earlier. And certainly for most of these organizations that we deal with, they do not have the skills and experience to tackle these issues. So where are we now? The gap is, this is basically the assessment output of the baseline assessment. It's a gap analysis that compares the controls to standard and identifies any gaps in the technical, administrative, or physical controls. Across these technical, physical, and administrative controls, maturity models can help assess and define the status of cyber resilience within an organization. For example, Kobalt uses gap analysis on SOC 2, ISO NIST, or the CIS Top 20 that assesses the maturity on each control for people, process, and technology. Cyber resilience also goes one step further and assesses the vision and steering of the governance part of the organization, as well as the culture of the organization and its maturity to cyber resilience. Outcome metrics are critical, showing the achievements against current goals. For example, the number and severity of security incidents logs, the percentage of staff who have completed security awareness training, the number of applications with known security weaknesses. So these are the kind of outcome metrics that you would look for that are actually measurable. We'll go a little bit more into measurable metrics later on. So the vision identified may actually take a long time to be achieved. And at this point in the project, an organization should define measurable success criteria for the next stage of the project. It could also include targets for the results of a future assessment, such a maturity target, a set of controls that should be in place, or a set of key performance indicators, or targets that could be achieved and by when. It is important that these elements or success criteria are considered SMART. So that's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. I'm sure you've come across that. So it's also important to identify these elements of, did we get there? So it's also important to look at improvements for this actual service management process itself. So things like event management, incident management, availability management, and improvements to configuration management. So here's an example of a Kobalt baseline analysis. I call this the unicorn demo for obvious reasons. And it's used in assessing where your organization is currently positioned with respect to the CIS Top 20. The ratings here measure the maturity score from 0, which is in the middle, all the way out to 5. And it's based on people, process, and technology, where people can be cross-trained, for example. Do we have enough people that are actually working on the incident management response? What happens if they get run over by a bus? God forbid. And process, do we have well-defined policies and procedures? And finally, from a technology perspective, from where there are no tools or technologies in place, which it would score a 0, all the way up to 5, where the tools are proactively tuned and configured for optimum performance within your environment. And you'll see there's a category here called application software security, which is kind of relevant for the audience. I mean, a technical control performance assessment. Here, we're looking at issues with configuration and hardening standards, lack of vulnerability or pen tests, or it might be a people problem where there's actually a lack of security design or security by design in your SDLC processes, where we would recommend our SDLC training programs. So here are the control.
To interrupt you, Keith.
Sure.
There's actually a question from Ashley, and do you want me to read it out to you?
Yes, please. Yeah, absolutely.
So it says, after we set our goal/vision, is it possible that once we do the gap analysis, we realize that our goal or vision is no longer achievable? What should one do in that case?
Well, if it's not achievable, you go back to the drawing board. Yes, I mean, that is a great question. I mean, all of these elements are cyclical, so there's nothing to stop you if you've gone and done a baseline assessment and you think, wow, we've really not captured properly here some of our elements in our controls and our goals and missions and objectives. And so we can't really apply this properly. So you may need to go back to your goals, mission, and objectives and check them. You know, similarly, when you've actually gone all the way through the process, you remember this is a cyclical process. So you will actually go back to your goals, measurements, and objectives. So the answer actually is it really depends on what you're measuring as your goals and objectives. And are those smart when it comes down to it? And will you actually reach your business goals as a result of these goals and objectives being achieved? If you can't, there's not much point in starting the business process. If you started up that gap analysis and find out when you get to the smart objectives that, hey, you're not going to reach the business objectives, then you need to re-vector and actually have a look at the business objectives. I hope that answers your question. So here are the control objectives for continual improvement. So initially we would actually look at auditing and reviewing. This is, again, you know, part of the assessment that you would go through from a people, process, and technology perspective. We would look at the controls assessment and actually see that they're adequate and fit for purpose. The whole objective about you know, making sure that you've got the controls assessment in place and then identifying where you really want to be for your goals and objectives is to identify the key performance indicators or benchmarks that will allow you to actually get there. So, you know, once you've actually created a set of controls, you can say, hey, in order for us to get to our mission goals and objectives for our business, we need to have these key performance indicators and be maniacally focused about assessing them on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to make sure that you're actually hitting them. Another thing is business continuity improvements, and you know, this can be the form of disaster recovery plans, business continuity assessments, be it business impact assessments, and also process improvements. So process improvements is really making sure that you've got your proper policies and procedures in place. So do you have an end user acceptable use policy? Do you have a work from home policy, which is kind of relevant just now for what we're going through with COVID? And then remediation and improvement planning. Like, how do you go about actually, if you've found that there's gaps in any of these things, how do you actually go about remediating, and where do you go for that? So let's have a look at some of these in turn. So audit and compliance. So good cyber controls become ineffective over time, or don't remain as optimal as when they were designed. The primary objective is to help organizations identify where it is in the continual improvement process. And the audit may be internal or external, but should be independent and objective. So it's fine if you've got independent auditors, that's not a problem, but they should be independent and objective, which is difficult. A lot of people who are looking at elements of internal audits are also some of the people in some cases that are actually building the policies. So it's important now and then, at least once a year, to have an external audit to actually make sure that you have an outside perspective on things. So the main areas to review are technology. So review not only the controls, but the hardware and software that's being used. Automate testing where you can. And an audit review should also consider digital obsolescence, that whole story about the firewall earlier on. You know, it's been in place and doing its job for several years, but threats have changed, and it may be time to update to the latest technology. So make sure you're doing vulnerability assessments, pen tests, and configuration assessments, etc. And then from a control performance evaluation, security standards such as SOC 2, they require an internal readiness and external audits for certification of the overall environment based on 5 trust criteria. So looking at control performance evaluation, but basing it on an endpoint of compliance is actually a really good idea. So any audit and review should ensure that compliance with existing policies are included. And the continual improvement review will validate the effectiveness of these administrative controls to ensure they still meet the objectives set out in the cyber resilience policy. And conversely, that policy is still relevant to the risks being faced by the organization. So one of the most important areas of controls that we look at is that one which is based on access rights. And this is access to your systems, or otherwise known as identity and access management systems. And these access rights should be based on the principles of least privileged and need to know. Do you really need to know and get access to these systems, this information, or this data? A common one is that we use is actually what's known as RBAC, which is role-based access control. So here, if you're an IT man, or if you're an accountant, then you should only really be getting access to your email and accounting system. There's no reason for you to be involved in any of the R&D functions or anything like that, or the HR functions. Whereas HR, there's no reason for them to get involved with IT. So that's based on their role. And so RBAC is a very popular method of doing that. And single sign-on or multi-factor authentication is another way to improve the administrative overhead of access rights. And an audit and review process should also review the supply chain. And the supply chain is always as strong as its weakest link, and we have to make sure it's intact and stable. And it seems that COVID has actually allowed a great deal of organizations to take stock of this and send out security assessment questionnaires to their supply chain. We're being inundated with people that are saying, hey, we need some help. We're getting inundated with these security questionnaires, and we don't know how to respond to them, or we can't say yes to some of these questions. So we're helping a lot of customers in that perspective. So also administrative logs and operator logs should be reviewed for suspicious activities, so that any abuse of the access rights that were discussed earlier can be identified. And reviewing activity logs regularly, especially administrative activity, is really critical. If you lose your admin rights on your system, then it can be catastrophic. So actually making sure that you've got someone reviewing your logs on a regular basis is a critical part of these audit and review objectives. So these are some of the other elements that can be reviewed on a regular basis. And some high security and regulated organizations require that all activities be logged and retained for a certain time to aid retrospective investigation. So logon accounts and user IDs should be monitored, especially administrative accounts, as I mentioned earlier on, and being able to test them from a geographic distance testing perspective. So if recently we actually had a customer that went to Hawaii on holiday, and when he logged in, it was, well, here's an unusual event. We've got an admin account logging in from Hawaii. So making sure that you're actually tracking not only when people are logging in through the date and time activity, but also where they're logging in from and how many successful and unsuccessful logons there are, right? So, I mean, excessive unsuccessful logons can be identify a brute force attack. And I mentioned the date and time activity. So unusual logon time should be assessed. So if you're normally logging on at 8 o'clock in the morning and finishing at 4:30 in the afternoon, but all of a sudden you start logging in at 2 o'clock in the morning, then your login system should surface that as a potential indicator of compromises. So IP addresses of source computers, any unknown devices in the network, and similarly for destination network, is anybody trying to exfiltrate any data from the network. So it's important to know where your traffic's actually being sent. So correlations with location of IP addresses. So a single log may actually look banal, but combine it and correlate it with one or two other logs, and you may see an evidence of an attack vector or an IOC. So in order to satisfy this, you really need to be using SIEM tools, which are security incident and event monitoring tools. And these help monitor and report in real time and correlate activities. And just remember, keep the logs separated and within strict access control. So they should be kept separated and secured so that staff whose activities being monitored actually don't have access to the logs so they can manipulate them. Make sure that the logs are protected by message digests or by writing the logs to read-only media. And delving through daily logs is an arduous task, so we would actually recommend consider outsourcing for that. That's not one of your core business functions. So, just having a quick look at some of these slides. I'll just slip through some of them because we're almost at 10 to 7. So, key performance indicators. Here's an example of some key performance indicators that you might want to measure within your cyber resilience element. So these are typical kind of security metrics, and as mentioned earlier, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So these should already have been set up in a design phase, but they can be assessed as part of audit and review on an ongoing basis to actually track trends as they're moving forward. So how do we get there? The previous work will have now enabled you to create a CSI risk register, and at this point create a detailed plan on one or more improvements, and that can follow either agile, waterfall, or whatever your organizational preference is. And it's critical that it's implemented in a way that's actually embedded into the organization. So let's talk about embedding into the organization for a problem. Just going back and touching on how we get there and how do we embed cyber resilience within an organization. These are a couple of key pointers. Improving cyber resilience is not just about creating and deployment, it's about getting the right balance of people, process, technology to achieve cyber resilience needs. But the best technical controls will have very little effect if people don't make the proper use of them. In every planned cyber resilience improvement, there should be part of a change management process. And that change management process, not adhered to, can leave it for a very ineffective system. So did we get there? So we have cybersecurity policies, which have been authorized by the executive board, and a portfolio of improvement of opportunities in the CSI register. So regular progress meetings should be conducted so each cyber resilience improvement is making progress. And this could involve daily Scrum meetings for an agile implementation or a weekly project meetings in a traditional approach. So next step is did we get there? As each improvement is completed, the agreed SMART targets should be measured to ensure that it's delivered the expected results and that the CSI register is updated to show the new status. After completing each improvement, carry out a review just to see what lessons can be learned with future CSI improvements. So how do we keep the momentum going? So there's two major aspects of keeping the momentum going. Firstly, we ensure that improvements have been embedded into the organization. Recall that the Plan, Do, Check Act of cyber resilience. This helps an organization identify where it is in the continual improvement process for each initiative. So always look at reclassifying, reprioritizing the identified opportunities. Secondly, monitor and report progress on the overall cyber resilience project. So keep the SMART targets front and center for KPIs that were identified earlier. And lastly, keep monitoring the changes, monitoring for changes in the threat environment, the business environment, and the technology environment. Now, for a bit of brevity, I'm always asked the question about the differences between compliance, security, and resilience. And I came across a few pictures that might appeal to the bikers out there. Here's compliance. You see that this biker has actually got a proper helmet on, but he's compliant. No policeman will ever stop him. This, however, is security. He's basically armored up the yin yang, and that is real true security. So compliance will take you so far, but true security will go one step further. However, cyber resilience is where you have your bike parked behind your RV. It's a complete backup. So in conclusion, cyber resilience, continual improvement, it's about a structured process. In order to do that, an organization has to have the discipline to be able to create and maintain a CSI register and its associated remediation plans. It can use well-used models such as SOC 2, ISO, NIST, and CIS that will allow gap analysis to be an ongoing discipline. So how do you know about it? What do you know about embedding this within the organization? So remember, this needs to be driven from the top down. It has to have a meaning to the board and to the senior management. Without it, it will completely fail. Finally, how do you change the culture of the organization? The human attack surface is probably going to double over the next few years. So this has to come back to a security awareness and training exercise. The message that you need to bring to your own organizations is that security is everyone's problem. So just a little bit of on Kobalt. So Kobalt actually helps organizations assess and enhance their cyber resilience program. And we typically use these three elements of assess, enhance, and operate. So we can come in and do assessments, program assessments. We can enhance your environment, doing policy development, security awareness, incident response plan, and then we can help operating your environment as well by doing 24/7 security monitoring of the logs that we talked about earlier. And so as a virtual security squad, we bring all these phases together to assist SMBs on their security and compliance journey. So one last slide here before I finish, and it's let's look towards a limitless future. Without security, there cannot be any innovation. I have my slides here. My contact details here on the second last slide. And finally, if you want to, you can actually book a meeting with me, and we can actually do a free gap assessment to your organization. And please feel free to subscribe to our mailing list. That's the information there. And we're actually online at kobaltsecurity.io. So Shobit, I did actually say that I would only take about 40 minutes, so my apologies. I've gone almost off the full hour.
That's okay. That's totally fine. That was a great, informative presentation, and I'm sure participants appreciate that. So now, since the presentation's over, we can open it up for questions. So if anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand, and then I can unmute you. You can ask your questions that way, or you can also put the questions in the chat, whatever you prefer. So does anybody have any questions? Okay.
And you know, the subject matter, Shobha, is quite dry, and you know, your audience is maybe you know, testers and QA specialists. So it may be the first time they've come across cyber resilience and whatnot. It is quite a dry subject, but it is important to understand the philosophy of following that continual service improvement lifeline, right, or life cycle. So.
Yeah, for sure. So does anybody have any question that they would like to ask? This might be a bit of a new topic for you guys. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand. I'll just give it another minute or so and then see if there are any questions.
Feel free to contact me afterwards if you have any questions, or if your organization is struggling with anything with cybersecurity, we can help. So yeah, feel free to contact me. Shobit will have my details, or I can actually manage to give you the recording of the I beg your pardon, my slide deck. I'll make sure that Shobit gets that and gets out to people.
Yeah, I'll put out the slide deck as well as the recording in the meetup group. So looks like there are no questions at this point. So I guess I can wrap up here. So firstly, thanks a lot, Keith, for taking the time this evening and going over you know, cyber resilience, and that was a great presentation. You went into great detail, and I'm sure this topic was a bit new to a lot of people, but I guess a good starting point for them. And also thanks to all our participants for joining this evening. Our next VanQ will be next month on February 25th. So please look out for the speaker and the post on our social media and meetup, and we'll keep in touch. And thanks for joining, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.